Tonight we drift to the banks of the Nile, where the dawn glows like liquid gold on the water and ibis birds lift lazily into the air. You're not a prince, not a priest, not even one of those heroic tomb painters people will later write songs about. You are something far more ordinary, and, ironically, far more vital. You're a scribe in training, soon to learn that the mystical world of Egyptian knowledge mostly smells like ink, sweat, and disappointment. You probably won't survive this. Not because of curses or crocodiles, but because your patience is going to be tested by the ancient equivalent of endless homework. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sand is already warm under your bare feet as you trudge toward the scribal house near the temple of Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom. His statue guards the gate, ibis-headed, serene, and holding a stylus as if judging your penmanship before you've even written a single line. You clutch a bundle of papyrus sheets, proud of how official you look. Somewhere in your chest beats the small but mighty heart of ambition, to write history, record the words of kings, maybe even earn a seat beside priests at banquets. And yet, as soon as you step inside, the dream begins to wobble. The school smells like wet clay and old onions. A dozen other boys already sit cross-legged on reed mats, some scratching their arms, others chewing nervously on their pen reeds. The instructor, gray beard, eyes like sharpened flint, doesn't look up. He just taps a wooden stick against his knee, a sound that says, "Fun is dead here." You're told to sit. Your mat creaks. A beetle crawls by. Welcome to the prestigious Egyptian scribe school. The day starts not with wisdom, but sweeping. Everyone takes turns brushing dust from the floor. Respect for the workspace, the instructor calls it. You notice that most of the papyrus scraps on the ground have been used before. Recycling isn't a modern invention. In fact, it's the only way anyone can afford to practice writing. Some scraps even bear faint outlines of earlier lessons, crooked hieroglyphs of birds, snakes, and eyes, ghosts of past students still haunting the page. When you finally sit back down, the instructor announces your first task: draw the sign for house. Seems simple enough, until you realize there are 5 slightly different house signs, depending on whether it's a noble's house, a temple, or a metaphorical house of eternity, which is a fancy phrase for tomb. You hesitate. He notices. The stick taps faster. Historians still argue whether young scribes began learning formal hieroglyphs or the simplified hieratic script first. Either way, the early days were pure confusion. You write one crooked rectangle, then another, until your page looks like an architect's nightmare. The boy next to you smirks. You accidentally jab your reed into your palm. Ink leaks. The instructor sighs loud enough for the gods to hear. That's when you learn the first truth of scribe school. Writing is 10% inspiration, 90% wrist pain. By midday, the room has grown hotter than the inside of a kiln. The instructor allows no talking, no daydreaming, and definitely no complaining. You try to focus, but your mind wanders to the outside world. The smell of fresh bread from the market, the laughter of fishermen along the river, even the shimmer of the palace in the distance. Somewhere out there, noble children are learning music and astronomy, while you're trying to remember if the bird symbol faces left or right. But then, something strange happens. As you copy the same symbol for the 100th time, the motion becomes hypnotic. The scratch of reed on papyrus becomes a rhythm, like a soft drum beat. The shapes begin to make sense, tiny doorways to meaning. You glimpse, just for a moment, what your teacher might see, a system that can trap the entire universe between 2 lines of ink. The instructor walks past, peers over your shoulder, and grunts, a sound that, in this place, probably means acceptable. Your chest swells with pride. Then he adds, "Don't get cocky." Pride deflates immediately. A quirky fact about these schools: lessons were often held in temple courtyards or beside storerooms, and young scribes sometimes doubled as errand runners, fetching ink, water, or even lunch for priests. That means half your education might involve chasing after someone's missing pen case. You begin to wonder if the gods truly chose you for this or if someone just needed free labor. When the afternoon sun slants through the mud brick windows, your reed stylus is already fraying. You watch tiny flakes of papyrus cling to your sweaty fingers like gold dust that refuses to be gold. The instructor finally calls the end of lessons. The boys stretch and groan, rubbing stiff necks. You think about how, in 1,000 years, some archaeologist will praise the discipline of Egyptian scribes, and you'll want to whisper through time, it wasn't discipline. It was survival. Still, there's something beautiful about the monotony. The ink stains on your hands look like constellations. The papyrus smells faintly of the Nile reeds from which it was born. You realize that each mark you make is a promise, to remember, to preserve, to be heard long after your bones have turned to dust. And just before you leave for the evening, the instructor mutters, "Don't forget, tomorrow we start numbers." You groan inwardly. Math. Of course. Outside, the sky bleeds orange into the horizon. The ibis statue of Thoth seems to tilt slightly, as if amused by your exhaustion. You bow respectfully, though you suspect the god of wisdom is still laughing. The breeze carries the scent of lotus flowers from the river, and you think, maybe tomorrow will be easier. Spoiler, it won't. But for now, the day is done. You tuck your reed stylus into your sash, brush the dust from your knees, and shuffle home through the glow of sunset, half proud, half dreading sunrise. The surprisingly boring truth of scribe school has only just begun to unfold, and the gods, apparently, have a long syllabus planned for you. You arrive at school before the sun fully crests the palm tops, clutching your small bundle of papyrus and half hoping the place has magically burned down overnight. No such luck. The mud brick walls of the scribe's house still stand, sturdy, lopsided, and radiating that faint smell of mildew and old sweat. This is your sacred learning ground, which sounds impressive until you realize the classroom is basically a glorified storage courtyard with uneven stones for desks and one cranky instructor whose favorite word is again. You squeeze past other sleepy apprentices and find your reed mat in the corner, the one that never lies flat. There's a hieratic proverb painted on the wall above your head: a scribe's ink lasts longer than a warrior's sword. Judging by the smell in this room, it probably also lasts longer than most students' patience. The morning ritual begins with sweeping. Again. The dust rises like a sandstorm, coating your tongue in ancient history and yesterday's boredom. One boy sneezes. The instructor scowls as if sneezing were a personal insult to the gods. Cleanliness honors Thoth, he barks, though his own feet are bare and dusty. You bite back a laugh, which earns you a glare that could petrify limestone. As the floor settles, he calls out the first assignment of the day: write the sign for Ka, the vital essence. It's a pair of upraised arms. Simple enough. Except every time you draw it, the arms look like they're surrendering. More reverence, the teacher says. You try again. The result looks like a very unimpressed stick figure. The boy next to you snickers until his reed snaps in two. The truth is, scribe school isn't the serene temple of enlightenment later poets made it out to be. It's chaos disguised as education. Between coughing fits, scratched papyrus, and occasional goat bleats from the street, it's a miracle anyone learns to spell Ra correctly. Historians still argue whether the average school operated under temple priests or private masters, but one thing is certain: neither paid much attention to comfort. By mid-morning, the sun has transformed the courtyard into a brick oven. You and your classmates shuffle closer to the shaded wall, trying to keep the ink from drying before you can finish a single line. The instructor notices the huddle and shouts, "Spacing. Proper spacing." He means on your papyrus, not your bodies, but you all scramble back to your mats anyway. You dip your reed pen into the ink pot, a mixture of soot and gum Arabic, and begin copying a list of common nouns. Man, woman, temple, beer, bread, beer again. The Egyptians had their priorities straight. The black ink bleeds slightly at the edges, and when you try to blow on it, a fly lands right in the middle of your word for truth. You sigh and decide truth with wings is close enough. Somewhere in the courtyard, the instructor is lecturing about the virtues of scribes. A scribe commands more than a soldier, he declares. A soldier's life ends on the battlefield, but a scribe's work lives forever. You glance at the boy beside you, he's half asleep, drooling on his papyrus. Eternal glory doesn't look very glamorous right now. A quick historical fact to keep you awake: Egyptian schools for scribes, often called houses of life, were attached to temples and served as both libraries and archives. The students trained to record everything: religious texts, tax records, medical formulas, even grocery lists for the palace kitchens. It sounds noble, but in practice, it meant hours of copying numbers while trying not to smudge them with sweat. Around midday, the instructor takes pity, or maybe he just needs a nap. He allows a short break. You stretch your aching wrists and wander toward the corner where the water jars sit. The water is lukewarm and faintly dusty, but you gulp it down like nectar. A few classmates whisper gossip about another scribe who got caught forging a grain receipt and was reassigned to tomb inventory duty. In Egypt, that's the career equivalent of being buried alive with your paperwork. Then, without warning, the instructor claps his hands. Return to your mats. The lesson continues. Groans ripple through the room like waves. You return to your spot, now slightly damp from your sweat. Today's next torture, subject, is geometry. Apparently, to become a fully rounded intellectual, you must know how to measure fields and pyramids. The instructor draws a triangle in the dirt with a stick, announcing that this, too, is divine work. You squint at it. It looks more like a badly baked loaf of bread. Calculate its area, he demands. You resist the urge to calculate how far you could run if you bolted for the river. Historians still argue whether geometry lessons were practical, for measuring farmland after Nile floods, or purely academic. Either way, for you, it's agony. You scratch numbers onto papyrus until the symbols blur into nonsense. When you finally hand it in, the instructor nods solemnly. Incorrect, he says. But spirited. You'll take it. By afternoon, your reed stylus has frayed again, leaving dark streaks across the page. You glance around, others are suffering too. One boy has ink on his cheek, another on his hair. The instructor passes by, muttering, "The gods reward diligence." You silently hope they also reward endurance. And then, the strangest thought sneaks in. Maybe boredom is the point. Maybe Thoth himself is watching to see who can endure the endless tedium without giving up. The gods, after all, are eternal. What better test of devotion than a lesson that feels like it lasts forever? You look at your ink-stained hands and imagine what they'll look like years from now. Steady, practiced, elegant. You'll be the one correcting others' hieroglyphs, maybe even tutoring noble children who can't tell a falcon from a duck. It's a tiny spark of motivation, just enough to carry you through the last miserable lines of the day's exercise. When the dismissal finally comes, the courtyard empties fast. The boys tumble out like freed birds, laughing, throwing scraps of papyrus like confetti. You stay behind a moment longer, tracing the word sesh, scribe, on your arm with your finger. It looks simple. but it's the key to an entire life of quiet power. As the sun dips behind the city walls, you gather your things and step outside. The Nile breeze cools your skin, carrying the faint sound of flutes from the harbor. Somewhere, fishermen call out, and the smell of grilled tilapia drifts through the streets. You smile wearily. Maybe tomorrow the classroom will feel less like a prison and more like a path. Spoiler, it still won't. But you'll show up anyway, because that's what future scribes do. Morning again. You wake to the bleating of goats and the slap of a water jug being filled outside your door. The smell of baking bread teases your nose, and for one glorious moment, you consider skipping scribe school altogether to become a baker. But then you remember, bakers spend all day near fire, and you spend all day near shade and ink. You sigh and trudge toward the temple courtyard. At least boredom doesn't burn. The mud brick walls look even duller today. Maybe that's because you know what's waiting inside, a lesson on tools. Not magical wands of divine wisdom. Not golden tablets etched with secret spells. No. Today, you'll be lectured on reeds, palettes, and ink. The holy trinity of tedium. Your instructor begins the day with his usual grunt of acknowledgement. A scribe is only as good as his tools, he says, tapping the wooden palette in his hand. You suspect he's said that exact phrase for 20 years, and maybe even dreamed it a few times. You watch him gesture to the array of items laid out before you. Thin reed stalks for pens, lumps of soot and red ochre, small shells for mixing, and a stack of papyrus sheets that look suspiciously reused. Choose a reed, he orders. You reach for one that looks straight and sturdy. It splinters instantly in your fingers. The boy beside you snorts. The gods test your hand, the instructor says flatly, though you can tell he's smirking. You try again, selecting a reed softer to the touch. This one survives. Victory. Now, to make ink. The instructor pours water over a small heap of black powder, soot scraped from temple lamps. You're told to stir it with a bit of gum resin until it becomes thick as honey. The smell is sharp, smoky, and faintly sweet. Soot for truth, red for correction, he explains, pointing to another bowl of ochre dust. The idea that truth is written in black and mistakes in blood red feels poetic. You'll appreciate it more once you stop accidentally spilling both. You spend the next half hour trying to grind ink smooth with a pebble. It's tedious, messy work, but it's strangely satisfying. The fine powder clings to your fingers, marking you as part of the scribal tribe, black-stained fingertips, the badge of honor no one asked for. A mainstream fact here: Egyptian scribes often carried their palettes everywhere, tucked into their belts like modern pens. Archaeologists have found dozens buried beside their owners, proof that a true scribe never clocked out. You picture your own burial someday, lying beside a dried-out ink pot. Very glamorous. Once everyone has their ink, the instructor moves on to the fine art of pen cutting. You hold your reed carefully as he demonstrates how to slice a neat angle into the tip with a small bronze knife. Too shallow, and it won't hold ink. Too deep, and it splits. You concentrate, tongue pressed between your teeth. The reed wobbles. Snap. You start again. And again. By the fourth attempt, your reed looks like it survived a crocodile attack. Acceptable, the instructor mutters. You'll take it. Historians still argue whether students had to make their own tools daily or received them from temple workshops. You're beginning to suspect the answer is both, depending on how clumsy you were. The classroom fills with rhythmic sounds, scraping, cutting, sighing. You and your classmates look like tiny craftsmen in a workshop of frustration. The boy next to you, Kefra, the one with a perpetually smug grin, holds up his perfectly carved reed. Mine writes like a dream, he says. You resist the urge to say, then go dream elsewhere. When practice begins, You dip your pen and draw your first test lines. The ink flows unevenly, blotching in some places, fading in others. Too heavy, the instructor says, hovering over your shoulder. The reed must kiss the papyrus, not stab it. You blink. Kiss the papyrus? You try to imagine a love story between a reed and paper, but it's hard when both are technically plants. Still, you lighten your touch. The line smooths. The teacher nods. Progress. After an hour, your fingers ache from gripping the reed too tightly. A small blister blooms at the base of your thumb. The ink stains your sleeve, your knee, and somehow your face. You look like you lost a fight with an octopus. Time for a joke, the gods decide. A passing breeze knocks over half the ink bowls. Black droplets spatter across everyone's pages. Chaos erupts, groans, curses, laughter. The instructor pinches the bridge of his nose. Order, he commands. Clean your palettes and begin again. Of course. Always again. A quirky fact surfaces as you work. Some scribes mixed special perfumes into their inks, cedar, frankincense, or even myrrh, to make documents smell divine. You wonder whether that was for the gods or to hide the scent of sweat-soaked students. Either way, your ink smells purely of smoke and despair. By midday, your reed stylus feels like an extension of your hand. You start to understand the instructor's obsession. The reed's rhythm becomes familiar. Dip, draw, breathe, repeat. Each line a heartbeat. You're still bored, yes, but it's a strangely purposeful boredom. There's comfort in the repetition, like the slow pulse of the Nile itself. Lunch is short, half a loaf of barley bread and a sip of water from the communal jug. You sit in the corner, blowing on your ink to keep the flies away. Kefra joins you, his grin still insufferable. He said my line weight was perfect, he brags. You nod politely, secretly imagining dumping his ink pot into the sand. Then the instructor's voice cuts through the murmurs. Back to work. No mercy, even during digestion. You drag yourself upright and resume your exercises, tracing the same shapes over and over until they blur into abstraction. It's exhausting, but strangely hypnotic. Near the end of the day, the instructor gathers everyone's papyrus sheets. He inspects them with the intensity of a priest examining omens. He pauses over yours, squints, then says, "This one has patience." The lines breathe. You blink. Is that a compliment? You'll treasure it forever, or at least until tomorrow's inevitable criticism. As the sun sinks, you clean your tools. The reeds dry neatly beside your mat, and your palette gleams faintly in the fading light. It's mundane, yes, but somehow sacred. These aren't just tools, they're the bridge between thought and eternity. The very instruments that keep kings remembered and stories alive. You step outside into the cooling dusk, ink still under your fingernails, and glance at the distant river reflecting gold and blue. The city hums around you. Donkey carts, vendors, the chatter of families. Yet part of you lingers in that courtyard, where a lump of soot and a stick became something almost holy. Tomorrow, you'll have to use those tools for the one task every scribe dreads more than anything else: endless copying. The morning begins the same way it always does: a yawn, a stretch, a small existential sigh. Then, the long walk through the city of Thebes, past clay pots steaming with beer mash and children chasing goats. The smell of fresh fish collides with incense drifting from a nearby shrine. For a brief, blissful moment, you wish you were one of those kids splashing by the river. But no, the noble destiny of scribe awaits. Today, you sense it's going to be worse. The instructor hasn't smiled in weeks, which means he's planning something painful. You arrive early, settle on your mat, and try to make your reed stylus look extra sharp, as if readiness could protect you. The other students whisper nervously, Kefra, ever the optimist, grins. Maybe we'll copy poetry today. You glare. Maybe you'll copy my homework instead. The instructor enters, silent as a tomb guardian. His palette dangles from his belt, black and red ink glinting like warning lights. He sets down a thick roll of papyrus. Thud. Everyone straightens. Today, he announces, you learn the path to mastery. You almost relax, until he unrolls the papyrus to reveal columns of perfectly neat hieroglyphs. You will copy this entire text. A collective groan ripples through the room. The instructor ignores it. Precision is piety, he says, pointing his reed at the nearest boy. And piety, gentlemen, is not optional. The work begins. You dip your reed, steady your hand, and begin tracing the first line. At first, it's kind of fun. The hieroglyphs look elegant, almost musical. Birds and eyes and zigzag water lines form tiny poems across the page. You imagine yourself writing something immortal, something the priests might one day chant beneath golden ceilings. 10 minutes later, your hand cramps, and the dream dies. You try to stretch without being noticed, but the instructor's gaze is everywhere. Don't pause, he barks. Flow like the Nile. You want to tell him the Nile floods every year and destroys villages, but you decide humor might not save your skin today. Hours pass. You copy line after line. The words blur into patterns. The repetition feels endless, like walking in circles through an invisible maze. Each stroke must be perfect. One slip of the reed, and the instructor's stick taps the back of your neck in warning. A mainstream fact to soothe your aching wrist. The most common text for scribal training was the Instructions of Keti, also known as the Satire of the Trades. It was basically an ancient pep talk about how every other job, farmer, fisherman, potter, was terrible compared to being a scribe. Ironically, you're now copying that very text while thinking pottery sounds kind of nice. As you transcribe, your brain begins inventing survival games. You count how many beetles scuttle across your mat. You give names to the ink stains. That one's the god of frustration. You imagine future archaeologists finding your papyrus and thinking, such devotion, such precision. They won't know about the fly that drowned in your ink halfway through the third column. Kefra leans over. How far are you? He whispers. Nearly halfway. You glance at his papyrus. It's a disaster. You've written the bird for Mun upside down. He frowns. Maybe he's resting. You bite back laughter, because laughing earns extra copying duty. By midday, everyone's hands are shaking. The instructor allows a brief break, more out of self-preservation than kindness. You stretch your fingers, which now resemble papyrus twigs, and stare at your work. The neat lines look almost identical to the original. Almost. You spot one small curve missing from the symbol for truth. The irony is not lost on you. A quirky tidbit: ancient Egyptian ink didn't just stain, it could reveal your emotions. Press too hard, and the papyrus tore. Write too lightly, and the line faded like cowardice. The balance between boldness and restraint wasn't just calligraphy, it was philosophy. You wonder if Thoth is grading your soul as well as your handwriting. After the break, the copying resumes. You think about the meaning of the text you're replicating. Keti, the author, mocked other trades, farmers who die under the sun, fishermen who smell like fish guts. You chuckle softly. It's basically a 3,000-year-old career ad. Become a scribe, it says, and you'll never suffer. The instructor recites that line aloud, clearly proud of it. You glance at your ink-stained hands, your aching spine, and whisper, sure. Historians still argue whether students truly internalize these moral texts or just memorize them by repetition. Judging by the glazed look in your eyes, it's probably the latter. Hours drag by. The sun crawls across the sky, pouring light through the slits in the wall. Dust motes drift lazily, turning the air into liquid gold. Your reed squeaks as it drags across the papyrus, and for a moment, you fall into a trance. The sound is rhythmic, soothing even. Maybe this is how monks feel when they chant. Maybe boredom itself is the gateway to enlightenment. Then your ink pot tips over, and enlightenment spills across your knee. The instructor sighs, mutters a prayer to Thoth, and hands you a new sheet. Again, he says simply. You sigh back. Of course. Always again. By the time the sun dips low, your papyrus roll is filled with perfect, well, mostly perfect, columns of text. Your hand is numb, your eyes crossing, but there's a strange pride humming under the fatigue. You've survived another day of hieroglyphic purgatory. Before dismissal, the instructor delivers his daily sermon. A scribe's worth is measured not by what he writes, but by how long he endures. You're not sure if that's wisdom or just a nice way of saying, get used to it. Still, you nod respectfully. As you pack up your tools, Kefra holds up his sheet. His lines wobble like snake trails, but he beams. Look. Art. You pat his shoulder. Yes. Art that will haunt Thoth's nightmares. The two of you leave together, stepping into the cooling twilight. The air smells of baked earth and lotus. Across the city, music floats from a tavern. Drums, laughter, the soft buzz of life outside the temple walls. For a second, you envy everyone not trapped inside a papyrus maze all day. Yet, deep down, you sense something shifting. The endless repetition is shaping you, sharpening patience, carving discipline, sanding away arrogance. It's boring, yes, but in a strangely noble way. Like the slow erosion of stone that makes a statue's final form. Tomorrow, the instructor promises, you'll learn about grammar. Somehow, that sounds even worse than copying. The morning sun has barely dragged itself above the rooftops when you arrive, already dreading the day. The rumor is true, Grammar Day. And as every student knows, grammar is where dreams of glory come to die. Yesterday's copying marathon feels almost pleasant in hindsight. You enter the courtyard, still hazy from sleep. The instructor stands by the wall with a reed in one hand and a papyrus scroll in the other, wearing an expression that says today, you suffer for knowledge. Around you, the other students groan quietly, rubbing ink stains from their fingers. Kefra mutters, grammar's just hieroglyphs with rules and judgment. You nod. So, worse hieroglyphs. The instructor clears his throat. Today, he begins, we learn the divine order of speech. He unfurls the scroll like a magician revealing his trick, except there's no magic, only a maze of symbols, dots, and slashes. Hieratic grammar, he intones, is the key to clarity. A scribe who masters it commands not just words, but thought itself. You can't help thinking that commanding thought sounds easier than remembering which line marks a plural. You start with basics, determinatives, suffixes, prepositions that somehow mean 6 different things depending on the sentence. The instructor drones on, tracing examples in the air with his reed. The house of the man is not the same as the man in the house. Confuse them, and you invite chaos. You scribble notes furiously, though your mind wanders to what kind of chaos he's talking about. Grammar demons? Rampaging commas? A mainstream fact slips in while you wrestle with syntax. The Egyptians used 3 main scripts, hieroglyphic for monuments, hieratic for daily use, and later, demotic for bureaucracy. Hieratic, which you're learning now, is basically hieroglyphs on fast forward, full of shortcuts that only make sense if you already know the long way. It's elegant in theory and deeply cruel in practice. Your reed squeaks as you copy the sample phrases. The instructor stalks behind you, peering over shoulders like a vulture with tenure. Your plural mark is lazy, he says, tapping your page. You fix it. Still lazy, he adds. You sigh. Perhaps it's tired, you mutter. His eyebrow rises dangerously, but miraculously, he ignores it. The day stretches endlessly. You conjugate verbs until the gods themselves must be bored. You start to notice the small things, how the papyrus fibers catch the light, how the faint hum of temple bees outside matches the rhythm of your pen strokes, how even the instructor's monotone has a sleepy kind of melody. Maybe grammar is less about rules and more about rhythm. You wonder if Thoth himself hums while writing cosmic laws. Kefra leans over and whispers, "What's the symbol for help me?" You reply, "I think it's just a blank space." By midday, the instructor decides you're ready for sentence construction. "Translate this," he says, pointing to a line on the board. You squint at it. The scribe brings bread to the temple. Should be simple, except there's a dozen possible ways to write brings and 2 for bread, depending on whether it's baked or offered. You gamble on one and finish with shaky confidence. The instructor nods, then says, "You've accidentally written the scribe sacrifices the temple to the bread." The class erupts in laughter. Even he chuckles, a rare miracle. Creative, he admits. You grin weakly. At least I fed the gods well. Historians still argue whether ancient scribe schools taught grammar through recitation, memorization, or direct practice. Judging by your aching hand and sore throat, it's probably all three. The instructor makes you read your corrected sentence aloud 10 times, slowly. Each word sticks like honey on your tongue. By the 5th repetition, you start to feel its rhythm. By the 10th, you could chant it in your sleep. You probably will. After the break, the torture continues. You now must write your own sentences. You try something bold. The student writes better than the teacher. The instructor reads it, raises an eyebrow, and taps your shoulder with his stick. "Ambitious," he says. "Incorrect." You erase it quickly. A quirky historical tidbit lightens the mood. Some scribes practiced grammar by writing model letters, fake complaints and memos full of exaggerated politeness. "May the gods multiply your greatness like the sand of the sea," one begins, basically the ancient version of brown-nosing. You imagine writing your own, "Dearest instructor, may your stick grow dull and your ink pot never dry." Probably best to keep that one unwritten. The afternoon sun creeps down the walls. You filled 3 papyrus sheets, each covered in tiny hieratic scratches. The lines shimmer slightly as the ink dries, like ripples on the Nile. You realize that grammar, for all its cruelty, is a kind of architecture. Each mark supports the next, every symbol balancing on another. It's not just about words, it's about holding up meaning so it doesn't collapse. The instructor seems almost pleased by your progress. "Remember," he says, pacing slowly, "writing is the voice of the gods. But grammar," he pauses dramatically, "grammar is their breath." The class nods solemnly, though Kefra mutters, "Smells like onions to me." You stifle a snort. By the end of the lesson, your brain feels boiled. Every symbol swims before your eyes. You rub your temples, but the dizziness doesn't fade. You imagine the gods laughing somewhere above. Let them suffer, for wisdom must be earned. As you pack your tools, you glance around. Everyone looks exhausted, ink smeared, and oddly proud. Grammar has broken you all equally, a shared misery that feels almost sacred. The instructor dismisses you with a final command. "Tomorrow, bring your neatest handwriting." We begin formal composition. Formal composition. The phrase sounds fancy, but you know what it means. More writing, fewer breaks. You sigh, stretch, and head for the door. Outside, the air feels almost cool, the sky streaked pink with sunset. The city hums with life again, merchants shouting, children laughing, the Nile whispering in the distance. You walk home slowly, reed stylus tucked into your belt, mind still tangled in verbs and determinatives. Somewhere inside the fatigue, you feel a flicker of satisfaction. You may not understand every rule yet, but you're beginning to see the structure behind the chaos, the quiet order that makes the world legible. Still, you can't shake the feeling that tomorrow will somehow be worse. Spoiler, it will. You arrive the next morning thinking maybe, just maybe, today will be different. The sun feels kind, the breeze light, and your reed stylus hasn't yet drawn blood from your fingers. Hope, however, is a dangerous thing in scribe school. The moment you step into the courtyard, the instructor greets you with an all-too-cheerful announcement. Today, we begin formal composition, letters, records, and moral maxims. You immediately regret being alive. Formal composition is where grammar graduates into real-world torture. You're now expected to write things that matter. The instructor hands each of you a blank papyrus sheet, still smelling faintly of the marsh. A good scribe, he says, pacing like a priest about to perform a ritual, writes as if every word will be read by a god, and corrected by a superior officer. You sit cross-legged, steadying your board. The first task, copy a moral saying from memory. The line is familiar, one you've recited since your first week. A scribe's heart is his scroll. You trace it carefully, the words curling into existence. The instructor passes by, glances at your work, and hums approvingly. Progress. The assignment grows harder. Now, he says, compose your own wisdom text. You blink. Your own? He nods solemnly. Show that you not only copy thought, but think. You stare at the blank space, mind as empty as the tomb of a forgotten noble. Kefra whispers, write something about ink stains being the mark of brilliance. You smirk. Too honest. You settle on, the wise student learns patience from papyrus. It sounds profound enough to pass. The instructor reads it aloud, squinting as if deciphering divine intent. Acceptable, he says at last. A touch pretentious. You beam anyway. Pretension is practically currency here. The day unfolds into a steady rhythm of writing and rewriting. The schoolmaster dictates sample letters, requests for grain, reports to temple officials, apologies to superiors. You practice the proper forms, always deferential, never too familiar. Remember, he warns, a letter reveals more than it says. Your handwriting shows respect, your tone shows discipline. You wonder what your ink-blotted mess reveals. A mainstream historical fact slips into your weary mind. Scribes were the bureaucratic backbone of ancient Egypt. Every tax, every harvest record, every royal decree passed through their hands. Without them, the entire kingdom would have collapsed into chaos, or at least into very messy paperwork. Writing wasn't art, it was administration in divine disguise. Halfway through the day, you switch to accounting practice. Columns of numbers, tallies of grain, totals of cattle. The instructor paces as you calculate. A scribe without mathematics is like a pot without clay, he declares. You nod, though your brain feels more like a cracked vessel. The Egyptians didn't have zero, which makes subtraction a philosophical puzzle. You pause to stretch your cramping fingers, watching the sunlight flash off someone's ink jar. The hum of scribes fills the room like bees in a hive, each stroke purposeful, each breath measured. For a moment, you understand the strange beauty of this monotony. Every scribe is a tiny gear in the great clockwork of Egypt, ticking away toward eternity. Kefra interrupts your revelation with a snort. You're staring at your paper like it's a love letter. You grin. It's more of a hate relationship. The instructor catches the whisper and fixes you both with that withering stare reserved for repeat offenders. You find writing amusing? He asks. Only spiritually, Kefra offers. Miraculously, the instructor laughs, a low, dry sound. Then your spirits will have extra practice. Both of you, write 10 copies of today's proverb before dismissal. You sigh. 10 copies. Your hand already feels like sandstone. Still, there's a perverse satisfaction in it, each repetition carving the lesson deeper into your mind. You begin to understand why scribes were trained through endless copying. It wasn't just about learning letters, it was about training patience itself. As the shadows lengthen, the instructor unveils a new challenge: dictation. He reads a royal edict aloud, each phrase full of pomp and impossible names. The overseer of granaries, son of the overseer of granaries, requests 30 jars of fine beer for the festival of Opit. You scramble to keep up, ink splattering. One wrong line, and 30 jars could become 30 donkeys. You can practically hear the future official shouting, "Who ordered all these donkeys?" Historians still argue whether dictation practice was done from royal decrees or mythic tales, but whichever it was, you're certain it was equally stressful. Every pause in the teacher's voice feels like a test of faith. Every missing word feels like an omen. A quirky tidbit breaks through your frustration. Some students in ancient Egypt secretly used broken pottery shards, ostraca, to practice instead of wasting papyrus. You spot one now on the floor, etched with a crude doodle of a cat chasing a teacher. Kefra must be responsible. Artistic rebellion, you whisper. He winks. By dusk, the school glows orange with dying light. The instructor announces, "Before we end, one final lesson, compose a short petition to the gods." You straighten up, intrigued. He adds, "The gods of paperwork, of course," says Hatan Thoth. You stifle a groan but obey. You write, "O Thoth, may my ink flow smooth, my wrist uncramp, and my teacher find sudden compassion." You're half joking, half serious. The instructor reads it, raises an eyebrow, and murmurs, "Ambitious, but sincere." You'll take that as a win. The day ends with the usual ritual: cleaning brushes, wiping hands, and massaging knuckles. Outside, the world has cooled. The Nile reflects the moon like liquid silver. You and Kefra walk home in silence, shoulders aching, minds buzzing. As you pass a wall covered in hieroglyphs, you stop and trace one lightly. For the first time, the shapes don't just look like art, they look like sentences waiting to be spoken. You think of all the scribes before you, their words carved deep into stone, outliving their bones by millennia. Maybe boredom is the price of immortality. Kefra breaks the silence with a grin. "So, philosopher now?" You shrug. "Maybe just tired." He laughs, and together you vanish into the dark, the faint smell of ink following like a shadow. Tomorrow, rumor says, the school will bring out its greatest horror yet: dictation from the instructions of Ptah-hotep, the most ancient and wordy of all wisdom texts. You're not sure if you'll survive. Then again, you weren't sure yesterday either. The next morning, you shuffle into the courtyard with the same energy as a mummified lettuce. The air is heavy, the sun already blazing, and every student moves like they're headed to their own funeral. Today's rumor has solidified into fact: dictation day, from the instructions of Ptah-hotep. You'd almost prefer being sentenced to build pyramids by hand. The instructor stands before you, tall and terribly awake. "Today," he begins, "you learn wisdom not from me, but from the ancients." He holds up a long papyrus roll, the kind reserved for texts older than half the gods. The scroll's edges are worn smooth, its ink faded to brown. "This," he says reverently, "is the voice of Ptahhotep, vizier to Pharaoh Jetkar. His words are nearly 2,000 years old. And yet, they still correct lazy students." You exchange a look with Khafra. "Maybe Ptahhotep can correct my handwriting," he whispers. "Or your attitude," you whisper back. The instructor shoots you both a look that says, "I can hear hieratic muttering from a mile away." You instantly straighten your papyrus board. The dictation begins. The text unfolds slowly, like honey poured through reeds. "Do not be proud because of your knowledge. Speak with the ignorant man as with the learned, for the limits of skill have never been reached." You write, the words heavy but smooth, each phrase ancient yet eerily familiar. Ptahhotep sounds less like a fossilized philosopher and more like a tired teacher trying to talk sense into teenagers. You pause midway through the line, realizing how deliberate every mark must be. Hieratic script doesn't forgive impatience. One wrong stroke, and "speak with the ignorant man" becomes "insult the ignorant man," which, judging by the instructor's glare, might be autobiographical. A mainstream fact rises through the ink haze. The Instructions of Ptahhotep is one of the oldest surviving works of moral philosophy, older than most known civilizations' written ethics. It taught humility, restraint, and the art of listening, all vital traits for bureaucrats tasked with navigating Egypt's intricate social hierarchies. You wonder if that wisdom still applies to surviving Grammar Day. By midday, your reed pen feels like a dagger in your hand. The instructor continues, unwavering, "If you are a leader, calm your heart. Do not be greedy. The one who takes too much will have an empty belly tomorrow." The irony isn't lost on anyone. You haven't eaten since dawn, and your belly feels very empty right now. Khafra groans softly, his handwriting slanting with fatigue. If Ptahhotep wanted us calm, he should have shortened his book. You stifle a laugh and accidentally blot your line. The ink spreads like a small black sun. You panic, dabbing it with your sleeve. Now you've got a hieroglyph for disaster across your arm. Historians still argue whether Ptahhotep's instructions were ever taught verbatim or used as thematic inspiration. Judging by your sore wrist and bleeding cuticle, you're starting to suspect verbatim. The instructor reads another passage, his voice oddly soothing despite the content. "The tongue of a man is his sword, and speech is stronger than any weapon." You glance at your reed stylus and think, not in this class. To keep your sanity, you start imagining Ptahhotep as a modern-day self-help guru. Vizier Ptahhotep's 7 rules for eternal balance. You picture him on a sandstone stage, waving his papyrus scroll. Rule 1, don't be a jerk. You almost giggle, catching yourself just in time. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces in your foggy brain. Some copies of Ptahhotep found in tombs include personal doodles, tiny sketches of scribes or animals in the margins. Maybe ancient students also fought boredom by drawing cats wearing wigs. You're tempted to try it yourself but decide you enjoy being alive. The afternoon heat turns the schoolroom into a slow-cooking oven. Sweat dots your forehead, making the ink smear slightly. The instructor seems unaffected, a hieratic statue of authority. "Concentration," he says softly, "is the scribe's shield. Lose it, and the chaos of the tongue consumes you." You're not sure what that means, but it sounds poetic enough to hurt. Khafra drops his stylus dramatically. "My chaos has consumed me," he mutters. The instructor doesn't even look up. "Then may it digest you quietly." You snort, choking back laughter. As the lesson drags on, the rhythm of copying becomes hypnotic. Each mark, each curve of the stylus connects you to a chain of hands stretching back centuries. You're not just learning to write, you're rehearsing eternity. There's something oddly comforting in that thought. Still, you drift. The ink dances before your eyes. You picture Ptahhotep sitting under a palm tree, composing his lines, wondering if anyone would care centuries later. You want to tell him, yes, old man, they do, but mostly because someone's making us. When the final passage is read, the instructor closes the scroll with a reverent snap. The class exhales as one. You have now written the wisdom of Ptahhotep, he says, voice softer. But writing wisdom and living it are different arts. He eyes you pointedly. Tomorrow, we test both. You groan inwardly. A test. Of course. Kefra leans close. Do you think it's oral? You shake your head. No, worse. Probably moral. You pack your writing tools in silence, fingers trembling. The courtyard smells of drying ink and warm dust. The city hums beyond the walls, a living counterpoint to your quiet exhaustion. You catch sight of the instructor carefully rolling the scroll, his fingers precise, almost tender. For a fleeting moment, you see the love beneath his cruelty, the reverence for words that outlive flesh. On your way home, the sun is setting over the Nile, painting everything in molten gold. You think of Ptahhotep's line about greed, and how your own greed for sleep might be punished by dawn's arrival. The breeze off the river cools your face. The city, with all its noise and chaos, feels distant, muffled, like you're trapped inside a memory. You murmur to yourself, half mocking, half sincere, do not be proud because of your knowledge. Then, with a tired grin, you add, especially if your ink stains look like camel tracks. The stars rise one by one, ancient and patient. You imagine each of them as a tiny hieroglyph written across the night sky, spelling out lessons you'll never finish learning. Somewhere out there, Ptahhotep is probably smiling, smugly. You wake up with the kind of dread usually reserved for tax collectors and dentist appointments. The test is today, your first real assessment as a scribe in training. It's rumored to decide who advances to the next level and who spends another season rewriting. I must not miss a determinative until their wrist detaches. Kefra meets you outside the gate, eyes bloodshot, clutching his reed pens like a soldier clutching spears. If I fail, he mutters, bury me with my ink pot. Inside, the courtyard has been transformed. Low desks line the walls, each with a neat stack of papyrus, fresh ink, and that faint, sharp smell of fear. The instructor stands before you in his finest linen, expression grave. Today, he declares, we separate the writers from the readers. You whisper to Kefra, and the survivors from the ghosts. The first part is copying from dictation, of course. The instructor begins to recite a passage, this time from a royal record. In the year of the rising star, the granaries of Memphis overflowed, and tribute from Nubia filled the royal coffers. His voice rolls on, measured and relentless. You write like your life depends on it, every symbol an act of survival. A mainstream fact flashes through your panicked mind. Official scribes recorded everything from harvest yields to legal disputes, temple inventories, and even medical prescriptions. Without their meticulous records, much of Egypt's history would have vanished. In a way, every line you write today is a faint echo of those long-dead bureaucrats who accidentally preserved eternity through sheer diligence. Halfway through the passage, your stylus splinters slightly. A tiny fray in the reed tip makes your lines wobble. You freeze, trying to fix it discreetly, but the instructor's eyes narrow. You may trim your pen, he says, but time does not pause. You curse inwardly and reach for your knife, scraping the nib smooth again. Each second feels like a grain slipping through the hourglass. Kefra leans toward you just enough to whisper, I think I wrote overflowed with frogs. You bite your lip, trying not to laugh. The next section is translation. You're handed a short paragraph in archaic script, half hieratic, half hieroglyphic. It's like deciphering a cat's handwriting. The instructor's voice booms. Render this into clear, modern script. Remember, clarity is divine. You stare at the passage. The first word could mean tribute or tax or possibly beetle, depending on context. You take your best guess and pray to Thoth that the gods aren't grammar purists. The hours drag on. Sweat trickles down your neck, smearing the ink on your forearm. You hear the faint scratching of a dozen pens, the occasional sigh, the shuffle of linen. It's a strangely peaceful sound, like the heartbeat of knowledge itself. Historians still argue whether scribe exams were formalized or conducted at random intervals, but judging by the solemnity here, it feels almost ritualistic. Every line, every stroke is an offering. You can almost imagine Seshat, goddess of writing, standing invisibly behind the instructor, counting your errors with divine precision. Then comes the oral portion, because of course there's an oral portion. Recite the wisdom of Ptah-hotep, the instructor commands. From memory. A groan ripples through the courtyard. You close your eyes, summoning every syllable from yesterday's torture. Do not be proud because of your knowledge. The words spill out shakily at first, then smoother, the rhythm returning like a remembered melody. When it's Kefra's turn, he hesitates, then blurts, "Do not be proud, unless you actually know something." The instructor stares at him for a long, terrifying moment. Then, to everyone's shock, he smiles. "A dangerous interpretation," he says. "But perhaps not entirely wrong." You and Kefra exchange a triumphant glance. He's alive. The final test is composition. You're told to write a brief letter to a superior official reporting a temple inventory. Simple enough, in theory. Except every detail matters. Tone, precision, calligraphy. You draft carefully. To the overseer of stores, "May your shadow be cool and your granaries fuller than your patience. I report 3 jars short, not by negligence but by rats." You pause. Maybe rats isn't diplomatic. You adjust it to small agents of chaos. Better. Ancient scribes often included polite flattery in their letters, comparing their superiors to gods or celestial bodies. You add, "Your wisdom shines brighter than the morning star over Thebes." It's excessive, but you've seen worse in real archives. Hours later, the test ends. The instructor collects the papyrus sheets with the care of a priest handling relics. No one speaks. Even Kefra looks solemn, lips pressed tight. Finally, the instructor says, "You will receive your marks tomorrow." Dismissed. Outside, the sun burns low, painting everything in molten amber. You and Kefra collapse under a date palm near the courtyard wall. "I think I spelled temple as donkey," he groans. You laugh weakly. At least you didn't sacrifice the bread again. Still, you drift. The ink dances before your eyes. You picture Ptah-hotep sitting under a palm tree, composing his lines, wondering if anyone would care centuries later. You want to tell him, "Yes, old man, they do, but mostly because someone's making us." When the final passage is read, the instructor closes the scroll with a reverent snap. The class exhales as one. "You have now written the wisdom of Ptah-hotep," he says, voice softer. "But writing wisdom and living it are different arts." He eyes you pointedly. "Tomorrow, we test both." You groan inwardly. A test. Of course. Kefra leans close. "Do you think it's oral?" You shake your head. "No, worse. Probably moral." You pack your writing tools in silence, fingers trembling. The courtyard smells of drying ink and warm dust. The city hums beyond the walls, a living counterpoint to your quiet exhaustion. You catch sight of the instructor carefully rolling the scroll, his fingers precise, almost tender. For a fleeting moment, you see the love beneath his cruelty, the reverence for words that outlive flesh. On your way home, the sun is setting over the Nile, painting everything in molten gold. You think of Ptahhotep's line about greed, and how your own greed for sleep might be punished by dawn's arrival. The breeze off the river cools your face. The city, with all its noise and chaos, feels distant, muffled, like you're trapped inside a memory. You murmur to yourself, half mocking, half sincere, "Do not be proud because of your knowledge." Then, with a tired grin, you add, "Especially if your ink stains look like camel tracks." The stars rise one by one, ancient and patient. You imagine each of them as a tiny hieroglyph written across the night sky, spelling out lessons you'll never finish learning. Somewhere out there, Ptahhotep is probably smiling, smugly. Morning arrives too soon. You wake to the sound of street vendors shouting about onions and fish, the smells of baking bread and river wind mingling through your window. For a brief, blissful second, you forget the test results. Then it hits you, today's verdict day. Your stomach drops like a stone in the Nile. The walk to school feels longer than usual, the sun higher, the streets louder. Kefra joins you halfway there, chewing on a date pit like it's the only thing keeping him calm. "You think he'll read the results out loud?" he asks. You grimace. He seems like the type to enjoy public humiliation. Kefra sighs. "Then I'm doomed." By the time you reach the courtyard, the rest of the students are already gathered in a tense semicircle. The instructor stands in the center, holding a neat stack of papyrus sheets, the kind of neatness that only comes from someone who enjoys grading. His expression gives away nothing. "You have all shown," he begins, "varying degrees of talent, diligence, and respect for ink. You can feel your pulse in your fingertips." He starts calling names, announcing marks in that maddeningly calm tone teachers use when they know you're dying inside. Mena, commendable clarity. Neferu, adequate precision. Hori, penmanship tragic, but effort heroic. Each compliment lands like a blessing, each criticism like a scarab bite. Then, Kefra. Your friend stiffens. "Your composition showed flair," the instructor says, "and an alarming sense of humor. You passed, barely. Try to offend fewer gods next time." Kefra exhales like a punctured wineskin. "You're next." The instructor holds your papyrus up to the light. "Clean lines," he says. "Sound structure. One accidental use of the word donkey where you meant temple. But your letter to the overseer displayed wit and balance." He pauses, then nods. "You pass." For a moment, you can't breathe. Then it sinks in, you passed. Kefra slaps your shoulder, grinning. "We live another semester." You grin back. "Barely." The relief washes through you like cool water. Around you, other students celebrate quietly, some weeping in joy, others sulking in defeat. The instructor lets the murmurs fade before continuing. Those who passed will move on to the next level of instruction, document preparation and archival duties. Those who did not will repeat until the gods themselves take pity. You glance at the unlucky ones, slumped in resignation. A pang of sympathy hits you. You've been there, in endless loops of ink and correction. Still, you can't help feeling a swell of pride. You're moving up. One tiny step closer to becoming a full-fledged scribe. The day's lesson is lighter, mercifully so. The instructor explains your next role. You will now learn the art of record preservation. For what use is writing, if it fades? He leads you into the archive chamber, a cool, dim room lined with clay jars and shelves packed with papyrus rolls. The air smells of dust and immortality. Egyptian scribes stored documents in woven baskets, sealed jars, and special chambers within temples or offices. Some records lasted centuries: contracts, poems, tax lists, all carefully wrapped in linen or papyrus covers. Paper may die, the instructor says, but discipline keeps it alive. You handle a rolled papyrus gently. Its edges crumble slightly, whispering of years long past. The ink, once black, has turned rusty brown. You can still make out fragments, names, dates, numbers. Each line feels like a voice echoing from the dark. Some of these, the instructor says softly, were written by students like you. Long ago. That thought roots itself in your mind, that the anonymous scroll of some exhausted apprentice could outlive dynasties. You glance down at your own ink-stained hands. Maybe one day, someone will hold your words the same way. Kefra nudges you. You think they'll keep our test results for eternity too. You smirk. Only the disasters. While you organize the shelves, the instructor continues his lecture. Archivists must protect knowledge from time, fire, and vermin. Especially vermin. You spot a rat hole in the corner and make a mental note to pray to Bastet later. Historians still argue whether ancient Egypt had specialized archivists distinct from scribes or if the same people did both. Judging by the amount of dust on your new duties, you suspect both. The instructor hands you a small jar of cedar oil. To protect from insects, he says. Also useful for polishing your conscience. You work quietly for hours, labeling, stacking, brushing away cobwebs. The monotony is soothing. Each document you handle feels sacred, a tether between centuries. The smell of ink, papyrus, and oil blends into something strangely calming. You catch yourself humming the rhythm of yesterday's dictation without meaning to. Archaeologists once found papyrus rolls used to wrap mummified fish, recycled tax documents turned into sacred offerings. You imagine your future work ending up as tuna bandages for eternity. Kefra snickers when you tell him. At least your words would feed someone, he says. By midday, the instructor announces a break. You and Kefra sit on the archive steps, munching on stale bread. You ever wonder, Kefra says between bites, why we even do this? Spend years writing for people who'll never read our names. You think for a moment. Maybe that's the point, you say quietly. We make sure others are remembered. He stares at you, then chuckles. You've been hanging around too much papyrus. The rest of the day passes in peaceful repetition. When dismissal finally comes, the instructor gives you a rare smile. You've shown promise, he says. Keep your lines straight and your heart humble. Pride dries ink faster than the sun. As you leave, the air outside feels different, brighter, cleaner. The Nile gleams in the distance, wide and patient. You walk slowly, savoring the thought that for once, you're not terrified of tomorrow. You survived the tests, the lectures, the grammar wars. You're still standing. Kefra walks beside you, arms behind his head. You know, he muses, if we keep this up, maybe one day we'll be allowed to write royal decrees. You grin. Or shopping lists for priests. He laughs. Either way, still better than quarry duty. You reach the corner where your paths split. Same time tomorrow, you ask. He nods. Wouldn't miss it. You wave goodbye, the sound of temple bells echoing through the air. As you walk home, you think of all the words you've written, the mistakes, the ink stains, the half-erased hieroglyphs. You realize they are not just lessons, they are proof of becoming. Each one a small rebellion against forgetting. And for the first time, the idea of returning tomorrow doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like purpose. The next week unfolds with a strange calm. Gone are the tense whispers about exams and punishment. In their place is the steady scratching of quills and the occasional cough from someone inhaling too much papyrus dust. You begin to fall into rhythm, Wake, write, file, repeat. It's almost peaceful. Almost. The instructor, however, believes comfort is the enemy of greatness. Today, he announces a new challenge. You will copy an entire passage from the instruction of Ptah-hotep, without error, hesitation, or fainting. His tone suggests that fainting is, in fact, a common response. You glance at Khepra, who mouths, "We're doomed." You sigh and unroll the practice sheet. The lines are packed with moral advice from centuries past, wisdom about patience, humility, and knowing when to stop talking. If only he followed his own advice, Khepra mutters. You stifle a laugh, earning a glare from the instructor. As you dip your reed pen into ink, you realize something. Your strokes are steadier now. The curves of the hieroglyphs flow more naturally, almost like muscle memory. The words are ancient, yet they feel alive under your hand. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. Scribes were among the few in Egypt who could read or write, a privilege that placed them near priests in social rank. The written word wasn't just communication, it was power, the voice of law and gods alike. Each glyph you draw feels like a spell, precise and permanent. Still, the boring truth sneaks in. Most scribes didn't spend their days writing epic decrees or sacred texts. They copied tax lists, grain records, and correspondence between officials arguing about fish deliveries. You imagine future you painstakingly transcribing, received, 3 baskets of tilapia, -1 mysteriously vanished, and suppress a groan. Khepra leans over. Do you think Ptah-hotep had students too? You nod. Probably. Poor souls like us, copying his advice about humility while plotting his downfall. Halfway through the exercise, your hand cramps. You shake it out discreetly, glancing around. Everyone looks equally miserable, brows furrowed, backs bent, tongues sticking out in concentration. The sound of dozens of reeds scratching in unison is oddly hypnotic, like the chorus of a very polite swarm of locusts. The instructor patrols the rows. Remember, he says softly, each stroke is an act of respect to the ancestors. You nod solemnly, though part of you wonders if the ancestors would prefer a nap. Hours pass. The afternoon light shifts from gold to amber. When the instructor finally calls stop, your wrist feels like it's aged 20 years. You place your pen down gently, afraid it might crumble from overuse. He walks among the desks, inspecting. He pauses at yours. His eyes trace the lines, the angles, the spacing. You brace for impact. Then, surprisingly, he nods. Balanced. Controlled. The gods might actually read this without sighing. You exhale quietly. Khepra isn't as lucky. Your hieroglyph for truth looks like a goose having an existential crisis, the instructor says dryly. Khepra groans. I was going for honesty through abstraction. After class, the two of you linger, stretching your aching fingers. I swear, Khepra says, one more scroll like that and I'll trade my pen for a shovel. You grin. At least then you get sunlight. That evening, you're assigned archive duty again, your least favorite, but at least it's quiet. You make your way to the dim chamber, the air heavy with the scent of papyrus and cedar. You're tasked with restoring damaged rolls, basically, recopying sections that have faded beyond recognition. As you unroll a brittle document, something peculiar catches your eye. It's a letter, written in hasty hand, not the neat formal style of official scribes. You lean closer. The text complains about missing wages and lazy overseers, essentially, a 3,000-year-old workplace rant. You chuckle softly. Some things never change. Ancient Egyptian workers actually went on strike once, the first recorded strike in human history, over missing rations of beer and bread. You imagine a group of laborious chanting, "No barley, no building," while holding signs shaped like loaves. Kefra would have loved it. You copy the damaged section carefully, preserving the work as outrage. It feels oddly satisfying, resurrecting someone's bad day for eternity. You wonder if your own complaints will one day be rediscovered, preserved by some future archivist who will chuckle at your suffering. As the hours stretch on, fatigue wraps around you like linen. The flicker of your oil lamp casts dancing shadows across the walls. Hieroglyphs seem to move, whispering their own secrets. You rest your head for a moment, eyes heavy. In the half-dream that follows, the symbols rise from the papyrus, swirling around you like smoke. The falcon of Horus, the feather of Ma'at, the ankh of life, they circle slowly, glowing faintly. You hear a voice, deep and amused. "So you seek knowledge, little one?" You nod, though your lips don't move. Then remember, the voice says, words are not power, they are burden. Once written, they outlive truth. The symbols dissolve. You jolt awake, heart pounding, ink splattered on your arm. The lamp flickers low. You shake your head. Too much ink, not enough sleep. Still, the words linger. You clean the spill, finish your copying, and roll up the papyrus neatly. The job's done, but your mind buzzes with questions. What did he mean, outlive truth? Historians still argue whether scribes considered their work sacred duty or bureaucratic drudgery. Maybe it was both. You've seen how ink can preserve wisdom, or complaint, for millennia. But it can also trap it, freezing fleeting thoughts into something unchanging. You wonder which your words will become. When you finally step outside, the night air feels thick with unseen stories. The stars reflect in the Nile, shimmering like unrolled scrolls. Somewhere, a temple choir chants softly. You breathe in the sound, the stillness, the knowledge that you're part of something vast and fragile. You walk home slow, your hands still smelling of cedar oil and ink. Every step echoes with the rhythm of your pen. Stroke, mark, remember. The gods may not notice, but maybe history will. And that thought, small as it is, makes all the cramped fingers and late nights feel, if not glorious, at least a little less boring. The next morning, you wake up with ink on your cheek and the vague memory of a talking feather lecturing you about responsibility. You blink at the sunlight stabbing through your window and groan. Kefra's voice echoes in your head. "You're spending too much time in the archives, my friend." The papyrus is starting to whisper back. Maybe he's right. At school, the instructor announces another shift in duties. "Those of you who passed the recent examinations," he says, "will now assist in real administrative work. No more practice scrolls. You will draft actual records, tax receipts, labor tallies, temple inventories." A murmur spreads through the students. Real work. Real ink. No more hypothetical grain counts or imaginary nobles. Kefra leans over. Finally, he whispers, "We get to be bored professionally." The instructor claps his hands. Quiet. The Temple of Knum requires new inventory scribes. They've recently expanded their granaries, which means more records to maintain. Accuracy is vital. Anyone who misplaces a decimal of grain will personally answer to the overseer. You swallow. You've heard rumors about the temple overseer, stone, humorless, allergic to excuses. Congratulations, Kefra mutters. We're about to experience divine bureaucracy. Your first day at the temple begins under the glare of Ra himself. The granary complex looms large, rows of mud brick silos, each sealed with clay caps marked in red ink. The air smells of dust and barley. Workers move like ants, hauling baskets of grain from carts, singing work chants under the blazing sun. Inside, the main record room is a cool relief. Shelves line the walls, stacked with rolled documents tied neatly with fiber cords. The chief scribe, a tall man with the permanent scowl of someone who has seen too many sloppy hieroglyphs, greets you. Names. You introduce yourself and Kefra. He nods curtly. Sit there, he says, pointing at two low stools. You'll copy totals from these tablets into papyrus form. If you spill ink, you'll mop it with your robe. You believe him. You begin. The work is mind-numbingly repetitive. 40 sacks barley, upper storage, chamber 3. 12 sacks lentils, chamber 2, over and over. But there's something soothing about the rhythm, the scratch of the pen, the faint scent of fresh ink, the quiet hum of labor around you. Mainstream historical fact: scribes weren't just writers, they were the backbone of Egyptian administration. Every loaf baked, every field taxed, every temple stocked, scribes recorded it all. Without them, the economy would collapse faster than a sun-dried papyrus in a thunderstorm. Still, you can't help but notice how unglamorous it feels. The myths always show scribes as wise men serving pharaohs and gods. Yet here you are, counting sacks of chickpeas under supervision from a man whose favorite word is recount. Kefra whispers, "If the afterlife has paperwork, I'm refusing entry." You stifle a snort. The chief scribe glares at both of you. Hours crawl by. You rub your wrist, aching from repetition. Then something odd catches your eye, a discrepancy. One tablet says 26 sacks of flax, another 30. You point it out to the chief scribe, expecting praise. Instead, he sighs. Check the shipment yourself. Outside, you squint at the bright sun. The granary workers eye you suspiciously as you count the sacks. There are indeed 26. You note it down and return. Clerical error, you say proudly. The chief scribe grunts. Welcome to government service. That night, back at your quarters, you and Kefra unwind by the riverbank. You realize, Kefra says, we're basically ancient accountants. You chuckle. Except accountants get paid in silver, not leftover bread. He tosses a pebble into the water. Still, he adds, feels kind of good, doesn't it? Like we actually matter now. You nod. Yeah. We keep the system from collapsing. You pause. Which, come to think of it, might make us villains in some stories. You both laugh. The following week, your duties expand. You're tasked with recording grain disbursements for temple festivals, how much flour goes to the bakers, how many geese are allocated for offerings, and how many jars of beer are lost to evaporation. Kefra finds that last one suspiciously frequent. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and safer to drink than most water. Laborers often received beer rations instead of wages. You imagine a future archaeologist labeling your records as the Great Egyptian Brewery Logs. At one point, you accompany a delivery to ensure accuracy. The overseer, grey-bearded, sun-browned, perpetually unimpressed, lectures as he walks. The gods demand precision, he says. A single missing sack of grain could unbalance offerings, anger the priests, and invite chaos. Accuracy is holiness. Historians still argue whether this obsessive record-keeping reflected genuine religious devotion or simple bureaucratic paranoia. Judging by the overseer's expression, it's probably both. The procession enters the temple grounds. Musicians play soft flutes as priests prepare the offerings. The air smells of incense and baked bread. You stand to the side, scroll in hand, noting every exchange. 2 jars honey, 4 baskets figs, 1 goose, no visible complaints from the goose. It's mesmerizing, this quiet choreography of devotion and logistics. You realize how much of Egyptian grandeur rests on the shoulders of unseen scribes ensuring everything adds up. Without you, even the gods would go hungry. Afterward, a priest thanks you personally. The temple depends on your clarity, he says. A scribe's hand keeps the world in order. You smile awkwardly, unsure if it's praise or subtle manipulation. Kefra whispers, if only the gods knew how many times you nearly dropped the ink pot. By sunset, you're exhausted but proud. You roll up the day's scroll, tie it neatly, and place it in the archive chest. Another line added to eternity. Walking home, the city feels different. You pass through the marketplace, the smell of spices and grilled fish mixing with laughter and arguments. The world seems busier now that you understand its paper heart. Every price, every trade, every temple ceremony, anchored by ink. You catch sight of a child practicing letters in the dust with a stick. His father scolds him for wasting time. You almost intervene, almost tell him that the boy might one day hold the world in his hand, that words are the spine of civilization. But you stay quiet. You remember what the feather in your dream said, words outlive truth. Maybe it's better if some lessons are learned the slow way. When you reach your quarters, Kefra waves a scrap of papyrus triumphantly. Guess what? He says. We've been requested to assist in royal correspondence. Actual palace orders. You blink. You're joking. He grins. Nope. The chief scribe said our handwriting was marginally less offensive than average. You laugh, the exhaustion washing away. The palace. The next level. Maybe the world of scrolls and ink isn't just endless repetition after all. Maybe it's the quiet path to power. As the stars rise, you lie back on your reed mat, listening to the hum of distant chants. You think of all the invisible scribes who came before, each one adding their mark to the endless papyrus of history. Now, you're one of them. Ink-stained, sleep-deprived, slightly sarcastic, but part of the grand design nonetheless. The next morning, you can barely contain your excitement. The palace. Even the word sounds heavy, full of gold and expectation. Kefra meets you at the gate, equally nervous. So this is it, he says, straightening his collar. From counting lentils to writing for royalty. No pressure. You grin, but your hands are sweating. The instructor leads your small group through the heart of Thebes, past whitewashed villas, perfumed gardens, and statues so polished they reflect sunlight into your eyes. The hum of daily life fades into the measured stillness of the palace district, a world of silence, guards, and order. At the gate, a tall scribe greets you, his robe spotless, his reed pen tucked neatly behind his ear like a weapon of intellect. Welcome, apprentices, he says smoothly. You are now the lowest-ranking writers in the most important building in Egypt. Congratulations. Kefra whispers, that sounded both flattering and threatening. Inside, the walls gleam with painted reliefs of gods and pharaohs, each figure frozen mid-victory. The air smells of lotus and old parchment. You're led into the house of correspondence, a long chamber lined with desks, scroll racks, and serious-looking scribes who glance up only briefly before returning to their work. The scratching of pens fills the air like the sound of rain. Your new supervisor, a thin man named Dadu, whose eyes have the calculating gleam of someone who can smell a spelling error, hands you a stack of partially written letters. You will copy these for record-keeping, he says. Precision is your offering to the gods. You glance at the first scroll. It's a request from a regional governor asking for additional copper shipments. The second, a note from a royal steward complaining about a delayed delivery of fine linen. The third, a politely phrased threat from the treasury about unpaid temple taxes. Bureaucracy, you realize, is eternal. Mainstream historical fact, Egyptian scribes didn't just record religious texts, they managed the empire's communication network. Orders, reports, and accounts flowed constantly between local officials and the central administration, all written by hand, all carefully archived. One slip of the pen could alter the meaning, and sometimes, the fate, of an entire province. You take a deep breath and start writing. The pen glides smoothly, your training finally paying off. Each glyph lands neatly in place. Khephren, seated beside you, hums quietly, his face unusually serious. After a few minutes, he leans over and whispers, "Hey, do you think the pharaoh ever reads these himself?" Dedu's voice cuts through the air like a knife. The pharaoh reads nothing. He listens. You write for the ears of gods and officials. Your words must sound like music even when spoken by fools. Khepren's eyes widen. "Yes, Master Dedu," he mutters. You hide a smile and return to your work. The hours slide by in a haze of ink and formality. You begin to notice the subtle art in phrasing, how a simple line like "the delivery is delayed" can be transformed into "the shipment awaits your gracious command." Bureaucracy disguised as poetry. During lunch, you and Khephren sit near a small garden pond within the palace courtyard. The papyrus plants sway gently in the breeze. "So this is royal life," Khephren says, biting into a figure. "Quieter than I expected." You nod. That's how power works. You don't shout when your words travel faster than your voice. As you eat, a group of senior scribes passes by, their robes trimmed with gold thread. One of them carries a document sealed with the royal emblem, the Falcon of Horus. Everyone around you straightens automatically. Even Khephren stops chewing mid-bite. The sight stirs something inside you, a mix of awe and curiosity. These men aren't warriors, priests, or nobles, yet they move the empire with their pens. They decide which words reach the pharaoh and which never see daylight. Silent architects of power. That afternoon, you're assigned a small but delicate task, copying a message about adjusting grain allocations after a poor flood season. It's addressed to a distant province. You must balance respect and firmness, authority and humility. You write slowly, weighing each phrase. When you finish, Dedu reads it silently, then nods once. "Acceptable," he says, which, coming from him, might as well be divine praise. Historians still argue whether scribes truly understood their influence or simply followed routine. You suspect it's both. You're only a few steps removed from the heart of power, yet you still feel invisible, one more shadow behind the throne. But the idea that your ink might shape decisions hundreds of miles away gives you a quiet thrill. Later, as the sun dips low, you're sent to deliver a completed scroll to the Hall of Petitions. The corridor smells of incense and anxiety. Officials murmur softly, servants scurry with trays of documents, and guards stand unmoving like carved granite. You wait your turn at a long counter. Behind it, an older clerk receives your scroll without looking up. He stamps it with a clay seal and slides it onto a pile that could probably feed an ox. You hesitate, staring at the mountain of unread orders. "Does anyone actually read all these?" you ask. The clerk glances up for the first time, his eyes weary but amused. Eventually, he says, "Usually after the situation has already fixed itself." You leave the hall shaking your head, suppressing laughter. The palace may be glorious, but it runs on the same absurdity as every school and granary, endless paperwork and controlled chaos. Archaeologists once uncovered letters from Egyptian scribes full of sarcasm and subtle complaints about their bosses. One even described his superior as a man whose words are long and whose patience is short. You make a note never to write that on papyrus that might survive 3,000 years. When work finally ends, Dedu dismisses you with a curt nod. "You did not embarrass yourself today," he says. "Return tomorrow." You and Khephren step outside, the palace lights glowing warm against the twilight. That was something, Kefra says, stretching. Do you think we'll ever write something that actually reaches the pharaoh? You shrug. Maybe not. But maybe our words will reach someone who reaches him. Kefra grins. So we're invisible middlemen of destiny. You chuckle. Pretty much. As you walk back toward the city, the golden horizon melts into deep blue. The Nile glitters faintly in the distance, carrying reflections of the stars. You realize how far you've come, from smudged school exercises to royal documents sealed with the falcon of Horus. And even if your name never appears on any decree, your ink will, quietly holding the empire together, line by patient line. You stretch your ink-stained hands toward the sky, wondering how many other scribes have done the same over the centuries, silently proud, slightly exhausted, and fully aware that the most powerful tool in Egypt isn't the sword or the scepter, it's the reed pen. Weeks pass, and the palace becomes routine, if bureaucracy can ever be called routine. You wake before sunrise, eat your bread and honey in silence, and make your way through the courtyards where palm shadows stretch like ink across the limestone floors. Somewhere beyond those walls, the pharaoh rules Egypt. Inside your chamber, you rule commas. Dedu has grown marginally less terrifying, which in his case means he only scolds you twice a day instead of 5. You and Kefra have found your rhythm, copying, translating, sealing. Some days it feels almost meditative. Other days, like being slowly buried under a mountain of papyrus. Still, you've begun to understand the subtle hierarchy of scribes. The ones in gold-trimmed robes handle diplomacy. The silver-trimmed scribes manage royal property. The plain-clothed ones, like you, keep the whole system from collapsing. You're the invisible ink holding it all together. Today, however, the rhythm breaks. Dedu enters the chamber with an expression of calculated dread. A royal audit is coming, he announces. Inspectors from the treasury. They'll review our ledgers, tallies, and inventories. If they find errors, we suffer. If they find none, we suffer slightly less. Kefra leans toward you. So, normal day, but louder. Dedu glares. Starting today, we double-check everything. And so begins the great papyrus panic of Thebes. You and your fellow scribes spend hours unrolling old scrolls, comparing copies, counting the same lists of goods again and again. By the third recopy of 16 jars honey, lower warehouse, you start wondering whether eternal life might just be a metaphor for paperwork. Still, it's oddly satisfying. Each correction feels like taming chaos, one ink stroke at a time. You even catch a major mistake, a shipment listed twice under different headings. Dedu raises an eyebrow when you show him. Sharp eye, he says reluctantly. Maybe you won't disgrace us after all. You beam. Kefra mutters, careful, he might start smiling next. Mainstream historical fact. Egyptian bureaucracy was astonishingly detailed. Temples, granaries, and royal households all kept meticulous accounts, dates, weights, transactions, inscribed on papyrus, pottery shards, or wooden tablets. These records helped Egypt stay organized for millennia, though they also created what some historians call the world's first paperwork-induced headaches. A few days later, the inspectors arrive. 2 men in fine linen robes, their fingers stained with seal clay, their faces arranged into expressions of permanent suspicion. Dedu bows stiffly. You and Kefra do the same, trying not to look guilty of anything, even existing. The audit begins. One inspector examines your section, scanning the ledgers line by line. He murmurs. Accurate. Almost suspiciously so. You freeze. Suspiciously accurate. Kefra whispers under his breath. What does that even mean? The inspector looks up suddenly. Did you verify this entry yourself? He asks. The grain shipment to Hut wear it. You nod. Twice, you reply. The numbers match the sealed tablets. He studies you for a moment longer, then nods. Good. Continue. Your heart resumes beating. Kefra exhales dramatically. If he'd asked one more question, I'd have confessed to something just to end the silence. The day drags on. By sunset, the inspector seems satisfied, or at least too tired to keep searching for errors. They leave with the kind of slow dignity reserved for men who know they'll never be thanked. Dedu turns to the room. We survived, he says flatly. Kefra whispers, can we add that to the records? Later, after the tension fades, you're assigned to update the master archive. You walk alone through the palace's quiet corridors, carrying a bundle of ledgers. The torches flicker, throwing warm gold against the carved walls. It's peaceful, in a way bureaucracy rarely is. The archive chamber smells of ink, wax, and time. Scrolls stretch endlessly along the walls, thousands of them. Each one a story, a transaction, a life frozen in reed strokes. You place your new scrolls among them, sliding them carefully into a labeled compartment. Year 23 of the reign of the king, warehouse accounts. As you step back, you can't help wondering who will open them centuries from now. Will they read your handwriting? Will they even know your name? Probably not. And yet, that doesn't bother you anymore. Historians still argue whether scribes viewed their work as immortal or anonymous. You suspect it's both. Your words will outlive you, but your name will vanish. It's an odd trade, but somehow, it feels fair. A faint sound interrupts your thoughts. Footsteps. You turn to see an elderly man entering the archive, leaning on a carved staff. His robe bears the emblem of the House of Life, the temple school where you first learned to write. You've grown since I last saw you, he says softly. It's your old instructor. You bow instinctively. Master Horam. He smiles faintly. I came to see how many of my students survived the system. He glances at the endless scrolls. Ah. Still believing ink can outlast dust. You gesture toward the shelves. It does, doesn't it? These words have endured centuries. He chuckles. Endured, yes. Understood, rarely. You walk with him through the aisles, listening as he speaks. The scribes of the past thought they were preserving truth, he says. But truth changes. The ink remains. One day, someone will read your work and see only half the story. You remember the dream, the voice whispering, words outlive truth. Then why do we keep writing? You ask quietly. Because forgetting is worse, he replies. The gods forgive mistakes. Time forgives silence. You both stand there, surrounded by papyrus and memory. For once, even Kefra's jokes couldn't fill this silence. After the old master leaves, you remain a while longer, staring at the shelves. The scrolls don't feel like work anymore. They feel like heartbeat after heartbeat, preserved in ink. You reach out and trace the edge of one roll, whispering to it, don't fade too soon. Some scribes added small doodles or secret notes inside scrolls, unseen unless unrolled entirely. You decide to do the same. On the inner edge of the ledger you just filed, you scribble a tiny line, if you read this, know that we tried our best. Then you roll it up tight and slide it back. When you step outside, the palace courtyard is bathed in moonlight. Kefra waits by the gate, holding two figures. Ordered survivors get treats, he says. You take one, laughing softly. As you eat, you gaze at the palace towers against the starlit sky. Egypt seems endless. Temples, fields, cities, all pulsing through words written by hands like yours. You think of the apprentices still hunched over their desks, learning their first awkward strokes. Somewhere, another scribe begins his story tonight. Boring, isn't it? Kefra says suddenly. All this writing, counting, copying. You smile. Completely. Still, he adds, I wouldn't trade it. You nod, the papyrus dust still clinging faintly to your fingers, like proof that the world itself is made of stories, and someone has to keep them from blowing away. The following week begins with an unexpected visitor, a priest from the temple of Thoth, the god of writing. You've heard of him before, of course. Everyone in scribe circles has. They say he carries scrolls that weigh nothing and everything at once. They say his words built the laws of the world. They also say his temple clerks drink too much beer, but that's probably just rival gossip. The priest's name is Panafa, and he's old in that ageless Egyptian way, lined face, quick eyes, voice like sand sliding over stone. He arrives at the palace archive at noon, flanked by 2 apprentices carrying sealed clay jars. Dedu greets him with a reverence that borders on panic. Honored priest, what brings the hand of Thoth to our humble ledgers? Panafa smiles. The god loves neat handwriting, he says dryly. But I've come for something greater than that. The House of Life in Memphis is compiling a grand scroll, a record of Egypt's finest scribes and their works. We request a copy of your most precise documents. Dedu almost bows himself in half. Of course. At once. He shoots you a look that says don't you dare spill ink on anything today. You and Kefra exchange glances. Kefra whispers, the god of writing himself wants to read your grocery lists. Congratulations. You spend the rest of the day preparing copies. Your hand aches from the careful, deliberate strokes, but there's a strange satisfaction in it. Panafa occasionally watches you, eyes glinting like someone who already knows what you'll write before you do. Tell me, he says finally, why do you write? You pause midline. The obvious answer, because it's my job, feels too small. So you shrug. Because forgetting feels worse. Panafa nods, amused. A scribe philosopher. Rare. Most just complain about pay. Kefra, overhearing, mutters, we do both. The priest chuckles and continues his rounds. Later, when the copies are sealed and the jars filled, he turns to the assembled scribes. Your work, he says, may seem dull, lists of numbers, names, debts. But know this, the gods remember what you record. The written word is a seed in the soil of eternity. You can't tell if that's comforting or terrifying. That night, you walk home through the quiet alleys of Thebes. The moon hangs low, silvering the mud brick walls. For once, you don't feel weighed down by papyrus. You feel connected to something vast, ancient, invisible. Like every mark you make ripples outward through time. Mainstream historical fact. Ancient Egyptians genuinely believed writing had magical power. Heikal, the creative force of the spoken and written word. Thoth, the ibis-headed god, was said to have invented writing itself, and scribes were seen as mediators between gods and humans. That's one reason even mundane documents were treated with ritual respect. Destroying text could be seen as erasing a fragment of existence. A few evenings later, Panafa invites you to visit the temple of Thoth itself. You have a steady hand, he tells you. Come see what steadiness can become. You accept, of course, anything to escape ledgers for a day. The temple sits at the edge of Thebes, overlooking the river. Its walls shimmer with carved hieroglyphs, each symbol picked out in paint and gold. You feel small as you step inside, the air heavy with incense and the faint rustle of papyrus. Inside, priests chant softly, their voices rising and falling like waves. Panifer leads you to a side chamber lined with scrolls older than anyone alive. This, he says, is the true heart of Egypt, not gold, not grain, but memory. He unrolls a brittle scroll with infinite care. This was written 400 years ago, he says. A scribe like you recorded a festival inventory. But here, see this note. He points to a faint line in the margin. He wrote, "The Nile runs high this year. Praise the gods." A simple thought, but because he wrote it, we remember his Nile. You trace the faded ink. It feels like touching the echo of another life. Panifer lowers his voice. Writing is the closest thing to resurrection. Not of the body, but of the moment. Historians still argue whether Thoth promised literal immortality to scribes or only the endurance of their words. I say both, because words become memory, and memory becomes soul. You look around the chamber, so much life captured in lines and loops. For the first time, the idea of boredom feels sacred. Every tedious task you ever endured was a strand in something immortal. Panifer hands you a small scrap of papyrus. Write something, he says. Anything. You hesitate, then write the first thing that comes to mind. The day was quiet, and I was alive. He reads it, nods, and rolls it gently. Then you are part of Egypt forever. Khafra would have made a joke about that, something about being immortal but still unpaid, but right now, you can't. You're too awed, too humbled by the thought. Later, you sit on the temple steps as the sky blushes pink. Children run by chasing a stray goose, a barge drifts lazily down the river, and the city hums in the distance. You realize you've fallen in love with the very thing you once mocked, the endless, ink-stained patience of the scribe's life. Some Egyptian scribes composed short scribe poems praising their profession, often boasting that their words outlast pyramids. Man decays, one such poem reads, his corpse is dust, his name forgotten. But a book makes him remembered. You smile. Maybe they were right. When you return to the archive that night, you find Khafra dozing over his desk, snoring faintly. You nudge him awake and tell him about Panifer's lesson. So, we're immortal now, he mumbles. In a way, you say. Just very, very tired immortals. He grins sleepily. Guess I'll haunt a papyrus roll, then. The two of you share a laugh in the candlelight, ink stains glinting faintly on your hands like sacred tattoos. Before sleep, you open your own scroll and add one final line beneath your records. For the gods, for memory, for those yet to read. Then you seal it, heart strangely light. The work hasn't changed, but you have. The morning after your temple visit feels different somehow. The palace walls look the same, the ink still smells sharp and earthy, the papyrus curls as it always does. But there's a quiet reverence beneath it all now, a hum you hadn't noticed before. Maybe you're just finally hearing the rhythm of the work, the heartbeat of boredom itself. Khafra notices too. You're smiling, he says, squinting at you. That's either divine enlightenment or heat stroke. You laugh, dipping your reed pen into the ink pot. Maybe both. The day drifts along in its usual way. More tallies, more receipts, more temple donations to record. You trace each symbol carefully, almost lovingly. The looping curves of the hieratic signs feel alive under your hand. For once, the monotony feels meditative instead of mind-numbing. You're no longer fighting it, you're part of it. Mainstream historical fact: scribes formed one of the most respected classes in Egyptian society. Though few were rich, they were literate in a world where most people weren't, and that alone gave them immense prestige. Pharaohs, priests, and generals all relied on the scribe's steady hands. To write was to have power, the quiet kind, the kind that endured. In the afternoon, Daydew gathers the scribes. A new decree, he announces, holding a sealed papyrus. From the vizier himself. Everyone straightens. The vizier rarely communicates directly unless something significant, or disastrous, is happening. Dadu breaks the seal and reads aloud. By order of the vizier, all junior scribes who have completed 5 full years of service will be granted the title of assistant to the record keepers and the right to their own seal. There's a ripple of excitement. You glance at Kefra, and he grins. That's us, he whispers. Dadu nods gravely. You've done well. Try not to disgrace me. That evening, you and Kefra receive your seals, small clay impressions bearing your names and the emblem of the palace. You turn yours over in your palm. It's nothing fancy, just carved with simple precision. But it feels heavy, symbolic. Like you've passed some invisible threshold. Kefra examines his. Do you think immortality feels this lumpy? Probably, you say. He laughs, and the two of you head to the courtyard. The sun is setting, and the light filters gold through the dust. Apprentices scurry past carrying bundles of papyrus. You catch sight of one boy, maybe 12, his hands trembling as he balances an ink pot. You remember being him once, terrified of spills, desperate for approval. You almost stop to help but decide against it. Better he learns the rhythm of mistakes himself. Historians still argue whether scribes truly enjoyed their work or simply endured it for the status it brought. But as you watch the boy steady his ink and carry on, you suspect the truth lies somewhere between. Most scribes didn't chase glory, they just wanted to leave a mark, even a small one. That night, Dadu hosts a modest celebration. Bread, dates, and watered wine. Someone plays a lyre, badly. Kefra insists on toasting to eternal bureaucracy, and everyone groans but drinks anyway. For a rare moment, laughter fills the archive. Even Dadu almost smiles, which is basically a miracle. Later, when the others drift home, you linger behind. The oil lamps flicker low. The silence is companionable, the air thick with ink and dust. You pick up your reed pen one more time and add a few quiet lines to your journal. I have learned that boredom is not the enemy of greatness. It is the grindstone that shapes it. The gods may speak in thunder, but they write in whispers. You seal the scroll, press your new mark into the clay, and set it among the others. Your words join the unending hum of the archive, the living heartbeat of Egypt. You step outside into the night. The Nile glitters under the moon, a silver ribbon winding through eternity. Somewhere across the river, the temple bells toll softly. You feel the day settling, the heat easing from the stones, the entire city exhaling after centuries of holding its breath. Kefra joins you, holding a half-eaten figure. So, he says, now that we're official, what do we do next? You look toward the stars, where Orion, the old hunter Egyptians call Sol, is rising. We write, you say simply, and keep writing. He nods. Boring forever, then. You grin. Exactly. The two of you stand there, side by side, ink-stained and content. The quiet stretches long and comfortable, like papyrus drying in the sun. Maybe scribe school didn't give you fame or riches, but it gave you something subtler, something steadier, the patience to see beauty in repetition, meaning in monotony, and immortality in ink. You can almost hear Panether's voice again. The gods remember what you record. So you keep recording. And Egypt keeps remembering. The night deepens now. The sound of the Nile softens, its waters whispering through reeds like a lullaby older than memory. The lamps in the palace gutter out one by one until only the stars remain, scattered across the desert sky like flakes of powdered gold. You sit on the steps where countless scribes have sat before, your seal cool against your palm, your fingers faintly stained blue-black. The breeze carries the faint scent of ink and date wine. The world feels smaller, quieter, perfectly still. You realize how much time has passed, how many dawns you've greeted, how many scrolls you've filled, how many thoughts you've turned to symbols. The years blend together like lines in a single script. And yet, it doesn't feel wasted. Not anymore. Each mark you made, each dull hour survived, each whispered word, it all became part of the great murmur of history. You close your eyes. You can almost hear it, the scratch of 1,000 reed pens across time, weaving the same patient song. You add your breath to theirs, just one more sound in the endless hush. Somewhere, the god of writing smiles. Somewhere, the ink dries. Somewhere, your story joins the countless others, waiting for someone centuries from now to unroll it and listen. For now, though, your work is done. The papyrus rests. The world fades into the soft hum of sleep. So, take a deep breath. Let your heart beat slow. You've earned your rest, apprentice of Thoth, scribe of the ordinary and the eternal. Good night.